So today we mark 30 years since John Joe's death, and his entire adult life was a reflection of years of Republican struggle to the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s and the 80s. That's a mighty stretch of time. 5 decades of selfless commitment to the struggle for Irish freedom and for independence. And he was the unbreakable Fenian, the gentle soldier. And in a speech he gave to Irish America in New York a few weeks after his release from Kesh in 1975, John Joe said, "I am here as a Leitrim man, a member of the Leitrim County Council, but in particular as a representative of the Republican movement to whom I have always given my first allegiance." And in all his years of service, John Joe never wavered in that. He played a key role in all the great decisions that Republicans were to take in the following decades. He was there during all the great efforts to reorganise, to mobilise, to advance the struggle for freedom. He came from a strong Republican family. His father Joe, but especially his mother Bridget Gallagher, strongly influenced John Joe's interest in republicanism. And his mother was influenced by the folk memory of the evictions in the plantation of Ulster. The land clearances affected both the McGirl and the Gallagher families, as I'm sure they did many, many families here this evening. His mother was an active Ballinamore volunteer during the Town War. She later received a medal for her activities. And John Joe had a particular affection for Leitrim's 1916 executed leader, John McDermott, a man who spent some time in Belfast where he joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood. In 1951, John Joe married Bridget Walsh, and together they had 5 children. They were very active Republicans. Liam was 4, Anya was 3, when John Joe was imprisoned again. He was released, and Kesh was born in 1960, and then John Joe was imprisoned again. Fergal and Nuala were born in 1965 and 1970 respectively. And they were children when John Joe was in Kesh. And like many Republican families, they endured prison visits in the absence of their father. Brady did a great job of rearing them all, and I have to say that John Joe would be very proud of how they've all turned out. More good. I had the great honour and the privilege to meet John Joe first in the late 1960s. That's 50 years ago. And it actually does feel like 50 years. It feels like half a century. But what I find very surprising is to realise that I'm now older than John Joe was when he died. So it's interesting just how life develops. And the first time we met, I got the bus from Belfast to Enniskillen one Friday evening, and I hitchhiked to Ballinamore. I slept in a field in my trusty sleeping bag, and I landed here in Ballinamore on a Saturday morning. On that first visit, John Joe brought me to sleep in Iran, to Loughallen and to Drumshanbo. And I remember the coal miners in Arigna were on strike, and we attended one of their meetings. And the year after that, I spent a few weeks camping on the shores of Loughallen outside Drumshanbo. John Joe's approach to building Sinn Féin, his huge commitment to transforming the lives of ordinary citizens, burdened by poverty, by deprivation, by emigration, his concern for rural Ireland, all helped to shape my politics. He connected the national and the local. He understood the importance of the restoration of our inland waterways decades before I heard anybody else ever talk about it. He campaigned for the reopening of our canal system, particularly the one here from Ballinamore to Ballyconnell. I recall also his commitment to library services, to the right to educational and health services here in Leitrim. He was a strong Gaeilgeoir, and like me, a faithful and hopeful supporter of our respectful county teams. You have to be hopeful if you're from Antrim and Leitrim in relation to all of that. He also ran a small business. Martin McGuinness, like me, loved John Joe McGirl. They first met in 1971. Martin enjoyed the hospitality of the McGirl household, and again, like me, the friendship of their lifelong ally, Mrs. Mulbehan. Those of us who came to travel regularly to Ballinamore were always warmly welcomed by John Joe, Brady and the family. And although older than most of us, he always treated everyone as equal. He took great delight in introducing us city boys to the wonderful hidden Ireland that is to be found in Leitrim. John Joe, as he said in the tape, was born in 1921, the year of partition. The two states imposed by the British government were characterised by economic failure, by immigration, by backwardness on social issues, by inequality, and by the failure to protect the most vulnerable of our citizens. Those who built this state turned their backs on the people of the north. They also turned their backs on rural people living west of the Shannon, and Leitrim people have borne the brunt of that. The new rulers turned their back also on the principles enshrined in the proclamation and the ideals of independence and a genuine republic. In the north, as James Connolly predicted, a carnival of reaction followed partition. The 6 counties became a Protestant state for a Protestant people, an apartheid state in which inequality and sectarianism and structured political, economic and religious discrimination were built into the very fabric of the state. 2 conservative states, here, this part of the country, and the part that I come from. And John Joe McGirl's response to this was to join the Irish Republican Army in 1937 at the age of 16. The following year, he was a delegate at the IRS General Army Convention, which sanctioned a new armed campaign against British rule with bomb attacks on English cities. The same year, he was imprisoned for the first time. He is one of that small number of activists who endured imprisonment in every decade of his activism. He suffered serious indignities, was assaulted. He has, as Michal recalled, the distinction of being present when 2 prisons were set on fire by Republican prisoners. In 1938, he was remanded in Sligo jail and then on to Mountjoy in Dublin. And the Féin government of that time embarked on a policy of ruthless repression of Republicans. Internment without trial was introduced, and in June 1940, John Joe joined hundreds of his comrades in the Curragh internment camp in County Kildare. And conditions in the camp were appalling. The internees were forced to live in cold, wet huts with inadequate bedding, no furniture, in compounds that became swamps, muddy swamps in winter. Food was scarce and many prisoners suffered from dysentery. And it was to protest at these conditions that the internees set fire to some of the huts on the morning of the 14th of December 1940. John Joe took part in that protest and later received a sentence of 12 months from the Free State Military Court. On the morning of December the 16th, he was one of those who witnessed a party of military police open fire on a group of internees. 2 men were wounded. Barney Casey, a young volunteer from Longford, died shortly afterwards from his wounds. And John Joe was also held in the notorious Glass House, where prisoners were regularly beaten up. They were forced to run the gauntlet by their military guards. Now, in the 1970s, when I was doing commemorations and other meetings, there were still survivors of that regime still about. There mightn't be so many nowadays. And some of them would come along and ask me, was I related to Dominic Adams? And I said, yes, he was my uncle. And invariably they would say, well, he and John Joe McGirl got savage beatings in the glasshouse. They wouldn't give in to the Free Staters. During this time that John Joe also learned to speak Irish from the likes of Martin O'Kane and those who he was imprisoned with. The discussions they held, for example, in the Connolly Study Group, helped to widen his own political awareness. When he was released in 1945, the Republican struggle was in disarray. The IRA had virtually ceased to exist as a functioning organisation after the harsh repression of the war years. And John Joe was one of those who set about rectifying this. Again, in March 1946, in Dublin, he was among 12 men arrested, and he was sentenced to 9 months. But his spirit, his determination, was undaunted, and on his release, he again joined in the task of rebuilding the Republican struggle. He was centrally involved in this during the late 1940s, and he was a member of the Army Council that planned and was responsible for the IRA campaign in the 1950s. Sean Cronin, who was the IRA's chief strategist and subsequently chief of staff, said that John Joe was indispensable, an absolutely necessary man without whom little could be done. He was trusted by people. A place to sleep, a bite to eat, a guide to take you on your rounds, the wherewithal to carry out a mission, a briefing on the countryside, a lift to the next place, all these and more besides, John Joe provided through his wide network of dedicated people for whom nothing was impossible. The intervention of Sinn Féin in the 1957 general election in the 26 counties proved successful. 4 TDs, John Joe, Gloria Braddock, Enachon O'Hanlon and John Joe Rice were elected. And John Joe, who was a prisoner at the time in Mountjoy, topped the poll here in Sligo, Leitrim with 7,007 votes. And in a message from Mountjoy he wrote, I pledge myself to work unstintingly for the ideals of all our patriots down through the ages, the freedom of our country and the welfare of its people. In the north, 2 other MPs were elected, Phil Clark and Tom Mitchell, though they were disqualified on the basis that they were imprisoned. The so-called border campaign ended in 1962. And again, on his release at Easter 1962, John Joe was back trying to reorganise. And speaking here in Leitrim at the Easter commemoration, he was unbowed and he was unbroken. He said, we realise that the tasks before us are not small, but if they are tackled by enough people with sufficient willpower, we will succeed. He was already hard at work as a public representative. He was elected to Leitrim County Council for the first time in July 1960. He lost his seat in 1967, but in 1974 he won it back again. He was involved in all aspects of work for the community. He was a member of the Leitrim BEC, the County Committee of Agriculture, the County Development Committee, the Library Committee, the Health Advisory Committee, and Ballinamore Old Age Pensioners Committee. 1969 was the year which changed all our lives. The violent response of the Orange State to the civil rights movement led to the Battle of the Bogside, the pogroms against Catholics in Belfast, and the introduction of the British Army onto the streets. John Joe was among those who took a stand in support of the nationalist people in the north. He threw his body and soul into providing support and help. Now, there were significant differences among Republicans about how we should respond to developments, and this led to divisions within the army and within Sinn Féin. And John Joe was at the IRA convention that led to the formation of the Provisional Army Council. He was also a member of the caretaker executive of Sinn Féin. Once again, he was at the centre of the reorganisation of Republican activism. He came to Belfast in 1974 to get the Easter commemoration speech. And by fluke, the Brits thought that he was Seamus Toomey. And they arrested him, and they discovered he was John Joe McGirl. So he was sent to the internment camp at Kesh. I was there at the time, and when we saw John Joe, poor old John Joe, we all felt very, very sorry for this old boy coming in. But there was no sadness, there was no despair in John Joe. He'd been down that road so many times before. He also had the biggest and the best wood parcels in all of Kesh. Mrs. McGirl sent in piles of homemade bread and cooked hams and all of the rest of it. Later, in October that year, the Republican POWs burned Kesh to the ground. And there was a fierce series of running battles through the night and the following morning in different parts of the camp between the Republican POWs and the British Army. And John Joe was hit on the face, on the jaw, with a rubber bullet. Now, we weren't able to verify this, but my recollection is that his jaw was fractured, but we weren't able to stand it up when we were putting together these remarks. But I went over to him, and it's a very surreal, difficult to describe scenario. There were watchtowers collapsing in flames. There were big coal gas bottles exploding. There were Brits and prison officers all over the place. There were explosions and the pop of CS gas, CR gas, rubber bullets. And I got to John Joe and I asked him how he was. And he said, "I'm all right, as long as you people are all right." The battle, of course, was very one-sided. The British Army had high protective red gear, that all of their weapons, the prisoners had sticks and stones. But speaking later about his time in Kesh, John Joe said, "I spent 9 months there. I was there when the camp was burned to focus attention on the plight of the internees. I saw young men fight hand to hand with British soldiers. I know what it means to be kicked, beaten, gassed, made to sleep in a blanket under a sheet of iron in the month of October. I was glad to join this new generation in writing their chapter in the fight for independence. I am proud to say of them that no generation has produced braver or better." In early 1975, John Joe was released. While in prison, he had been elected for the second time as a councillor, and he worked tirelessly for the people of Leitrim during the following years until his death in 1988. Between 1981 and 1982, he was chairperson of Leitrim County Council. And during this time, there's a photograph we have up in Leinster House, a famous photograph of him walking out of the gates of Leinster House. He was denied access to a minister, even though he was there on behalf of the county council. He wasn't there as a Sinn Féin representative, he was there as chairperson of the council. And these were the years of censorship, Section 32, Section 31 even, the exclusion of Sinn Féin, and more importantly, the demonising and the undermining of the rights of the people who voted for us by those who would tell us that they're Democrats. Within weeks of his release, he was in New York, rallying support for our cause. He later became vice president of Sinn Féin, and during the 1981 hunger strikes, John Joe travelled the length and breadth of this state, rallying support for the hunger strikers. In the general election in June, Kieran Doherty and Paddy Agnew were elected as TDs. Joe McDonnell came close to taking a seat here in Sligo, Leitrim. And Joe died in the early hours of July the 8th, on the 61st day of his hunger strike. And despite the risk of arrest, John Joe attended Joe's funeral in Belfast. And he was there when the British Army and the RUC attacked the funeral. He gave the oration at Joe's graveside in Milltown. John Joe said that Joe MacDonald had died rather than debase the cause he served, rather than live with the forced tag of criminality. He went on to say, "We will build Joe MacDonald a memorial that will be the freedom and unity of the Irish people." Two years later, the Hitsblock prisoners took part in the Great Escape when 38 broke out of Kesh. And among them was Gerry Kelly, who often tells that when he and others arrived in Leitrim, it was John Joe who dispersed them in safe houses round Ballinamore. So don't let on to anybody if you took in any of those prisoners, but a big bowl of bus for you all. 3 years later, in the Ardèche in 1986, John Joe seconded the motion calling for an end to the abstentionist policy towards Leinster House. And as a former abstentionist TD, that was a big decision for him to take. And I know he thought long and he thought hard about it. And his contribution that day was passionate and it was compelling. He brought the Ardèche to its feet. For John Joe, it was a necessary step if, in his words, we are not going to hand down this struggle to another generation. The following year, he led again by example and stood in the February general election for Sligo Leitrim. And, as we know, 30 years ago today, on the 8th of December, John Joe McGirl died. He had asked if I would give his oration. It was a great honour, but it was also very difficult. In the ups and downs of his life of struggle, John Joe had led from the front. No task was too small, no task was too great. His first loyalty was always to the Republican struggle. He had no time for splitters, no time for those who place self-interest or ego before the goal of Irish unity. And at his graveside I said that John Joe was never content merely to preserve the past or to commemorate past deeds. Yes, the past was important to him, but the future was what mattered most. He had foresight, he had moral courage, and he had physical courage. And he was gentle. He said his piece without malice. He considered the options. He listened to others, and then he took his own decision. And I described him as one of the great invincibles, an unrepentant Fenian. Now, in Republican jargon, you hear about a 30s man or woman, or a 40s man or woman, or a 50s man or woman. John Joe was a man of the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and into this invincible generation of today. And he said many, many times that it's our job to finish the struggle. And that is our job, to finish the struggle which he epitomised. He believed that the struggle was where he was. He believed that the struggle is where each of us is. He'd be delighted that we have a new leadership led by Mary Lou. He believed that the end of British rule in our country was part of a greater struggle to end poverty, to end indignity and materialism, and for the beginning of peace and justice and equality and freedom. And Martin McGuinness, in a tribute to John Joe, summed up his commitment. He described John Joe as a progressive thinker, always prepared to consider, support and propose new ways for the Republican movement to advance. He wasn't prepared to stand still or hold to old, outdated tactics which were incapable of developing the struggle on all fronts. He was an extraordinary man, an inspiration to all who knew him, and we cherish his memory. And it is, as Maureen said, really important that Fhégra and Leona and Cara are here this evening. So, that brings us to where we are here tonight. You can go out of here and say we had a good night, and Cara sang beautifully, and Stella played the Vox Cacul, the music box, with great skill, and Gerry talked for far too long. But what do we do when we leave here? What do we do when we go out the door here? If John Joe was here, we know what he would say. He would say, as Bobby Sands said, that everyone has a role to play. So, every one of us in this hall, every man, woman in this hall, has a role to play. And each of us needs to create the space for each other so that our roles collectively strengthen and advance our struggle here in Leitrim. In May we have councillors and an MEP to elect. We have a referendum, a very important referendum on voting rights in presidential elections for people in the north, in the diaspora. We have that referendum to win. And we can, if we go at it properly, get 2 TDs elected for Sligo Leitrim, Martin Kenny and Chris McManus, whenever Mr. Baradker or his deputy, Micheál Martin, calls a general election. Now, of course, all of us, there's distractions all around us, distractions in all of our lives, and all of us could, find distractions which mean that we don't get to play our full role. And every group of human beings will have its faults, its failings, its differences of opinion, its personalities. That's actually that's an enriching part of the human condition. It can also be a very positive dynamic in the group's momentum. Positivity is our friend. Negativity is our enemy. When John Joe was alive, there was no peaceful or democratic way to win Irish unity. Neither is. We are the generation who won that. We won that through 40 years of relentless ongoing struggle. And we're the generation also who can win that referendum. We can actually end partition. We can end British rule on this island. That's within our grasp if we focus ourselves intelligently and strategically and in a united way. 30 years ago, John Joe had been ill for some time, and I called to see him and Mrs. McGirl, and I was on my own. And he asked me to take him out to Garadice. And after I was fed and watered, I drove him there. I haven't talked about this before. I drove him out to the loch. It was a bright, sunny, late summer's day. And he sat beside me at the loch. And at one point he surprised me. He took off his shirt. And he was wearing a white simmet. And he really enjoyed the sun on his bare arms and on his face. And he knew he was dying. And he said he was sorry that he wouldn't live to see Ireland united, but that he felt great progress had been made, and he was glad that he was part of that. He said he wouldn't have missed a minute of it. And we only sat there for about half an hour or so, and on the way back to Ballinamore, he said he had great confidence for the future. So, friends, you're the future. Nobody else. You're the future. People here are the future. Like John Joe, you can actually shape history. Some of you have. Some of the old hands here have shaped history, if you really want to. And You know, John Joe didn't need to do all the things that he did here in his beloved Leitrim and across this island. And none of us need to do as much as he did. None of us. We don't need to do as much as Martin McGuinness did. We need to do as much as Maria Farrell did. We need to do the best that we can. We need to do whatever is within our ability to do. And even if it's only that much, that's brilliant. So, let me say this. Whatever you do, before you do it, ask yourself, if you're an activist, does this action, does this remark, does this move advance our cause? Does this promote our Republican objectives? And if it doesn't, then don't do it. Do only positive actions, voice only positive thoughts, respect and appreciate each other, be united and cohesive and active, and be the best activist that you can be the best Republican that you can be. And if you're not an activist, let tonight be the night that you become an activist. John Joe was a uniter. So, Mara Jerter, Ninyart, go cur the Helia. Unity is strength. Mrs. McGirl, thank you for your great fortitude, for your courage, for your quiet smile, for all the cups of tea, for your great patience. In front of every great woman, there's a man. So, thank you, Bridie McGirl, for being a great, great woman. Thank you for being our mammo. Up Leitrim, John Joe Abu.